privacy and so we are at this webinar sponsored by ASA, the Privacy and Confidentiality Community. And today it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Merlin. And I'm going to keep this introduction very brief, otherwise this will take quite a few minutes. So Dr. Brad Merlin is an international leader in data privacy, security, and AI. And Dr. Merlin got his PhD in computer science from CMU. And he is currently Accenture Professor of Biomedical Informatics, Biostatistics, and Computer Science at Vanderbilt University, and the Vice Chair of the Department of Biomedical Informatics at the Vanderbilt Medical Center. So Dr. Merlin has won many awards, including the Presidential Early Career Award for Scientists and Engineers. This is known as a PCASE from the White House. And he is also elected fellow of the American College of Medical Informatics. This is known as ACME Fellow. And he is also an elected fellow of the National Academy of Medicine. So back in 2016, he founded the center Get Precise, one of the NIH centers of excellence on ethical, legal, and social implication research. In 2021, he becomes one of the PIs of the NIH's Aim Ahead initiative. And last year, he becomes the lead PI of the Ethics and Trustworthy AI Core for the NIH-sponsored Bridge to AI Center. So today, we will hear from Dr. Merlin about his knowledge and experience on how to re-identify the re-identification occurred in large biomedical data sets and how to formalize such threats and how to design social technical approaches for mitigation. And this talk will draw based on his experience from large NIH programs involving EHR data and genomic data and these of-us research program. So without further ado, let's get started. So Brad, feel free to take it away. Thank you.
All right, I got it. Thanks. Great introduction. Thanks a lot for everybody who's shown up today. This is meant to be an inclusive discussion. I know it's going to be a seminar, but if somebody feels the need to really cut me off and ask for something, definitely do so and just throw it into the Q&A function. So I called this modeling, measuring, and mitigating privacy risks because I want to go through the procession of how we go about thinking about these issues. Because it's not just a matter of just telling you what privacy is, in my opinion. So where do we start? I want to start by talking about the paradigm. The way in which we think about analytics is going to be performed in large biomedical research settings. Where we've been seeing things heading over the last couple of years or so is this notion of becoming more entwined with the crypto community, and where you have data and you have some analysis that wants to be run or wants to be supported at a particular client, and then they're going to say, like, I don't have the computational capability to do this locally, and so I want to outsource it. And I want to send it over to some large compute environment that some organization like Microsoft or Amazon may be standing up. And so what we're going to do is we'll encrypt the data and we'll send it out to the server. And then the analysis itself is going to be encrypted. And then we're going to get some type of a result back. And this result is going to be some type of an aggregation that's been performed over the data, like a sum. All right. So this is what you've seen with things like with secure multi-party computation, particularly with examples like homomorphic encryption. So this is just outsourcing of your own data for analysis. Where SMC has also started to go is this notion of joint analysis, where you have one organization with data and you have another organization that wants to learn a model. And so they're both going to encrypt what they're working on. So the data gets encrypted, the machine learning model gets encrypted. They jointly perform some analysis here. And then there's some result, some new knowledge or some new analytic result that gets sent back to the organization that had the data. And then it's up to them to decide whether or not they want to disclose it to organization B in this situation. You could also have set this up so that the knowledge was learned by organization B, not organization A. There is a way of just controlling the system. what's important here is that the entire analytic process, again, remains in an encrypted setting. Where this is also starting to go is the notion of trusted computing environments. So what do I mean? So this is very similar to what I was just talking about. You've got two organizations, one with data, one with an ML model that they're trying to learn. And then what you do is you create some type of a protected zone on somebody's server. Okay. Now, what do I mean by a protected zone? The notion of a protected zone could be trusted RAM or some type of a tamper-resistant co-processing chip that just lives on a machine. And so this may sound like far-fetched, but this is exactly what Intel and AMD have been doing for the last several years. And even on your phone, you will find that there are trusted computing environments through things like Intel's Software Guard Exchange. And so what that means is that you can encrypt all the data, put it into the trusted environment, do whatever you want to do in that environment, and then pull the data, encrypt it, pull it back out, and then decrypt it for whoever's supposed to analyze it. So this is known as a TEE, or a trusted execution environment framework. And so this is also one of the ways that we're seeing the community try to push towards. Okay, so this is like the really fun computer science component, and I could spend a whole long lecture talking about it. But where I live most of my time is in a situation where people say, I don't know what model it is that I want to bring to your data. And so if I don't know what model I want to bring to the table, then I just want you to show me the data. And if you're not going to show me the data, I don't really want to play in your crypto space. Okay, and so this doesn't mean that people shouldn't be doing research on secure multi-party computation or trusted execution environments, but we're never going to get away from the situation where people are be provided with data. Now, what do you worry about? So what people start to worry about when they're asked to share data, whether or not they know it, is they're worried about this guy. Now, who this is Bill Weld. He used to be the governor of the state of Massachusetts. And the reason why people care about him is that he's kind of the poster child for what can go wrong when you share data to external entities that are going to be performing analytics. So this all goes back about 25 years now to a re-identification study that was run in which he got caught up in it. And the story goes as follows. Basically, he's receiving an honorary doctorate on stage. He collapses. Nobody knows what happened to him. Okay. What they do know is that he gets admitted to Massachusetts General Hospital. And so there's like some interest in him as a VIP. So what around the same time was happening was that there was this big push across the country to do comparative effectiveness policy analysis. So when that was happening, you had a situation in which people went to all the states and they said, what do you need to do comparative effectiveness research for health? And they said, look, we need the demographics of the patients. We need to know how much things cost. We need to know what happened to them. And so this became known as the hospital discharge databases. Now, when the governor collapsed, it was known that he was going to show up in the state of Massachusetts hospital discharge data. Now, what people also probably didn't realize was that there were publicly available resources that were fully identified that also had the same factors on him that would be useful for linking that hospital discharge record back to his identity. And so what ended up happening was this really famous study now that was done by LaTanya Sweeney, that she basically showed that if you go and you grab the city of Cambridge's voter registration list, and she paid $20 for it, and that was publicly accessible, that you could find that he was the only guy living in his 5-digit zip code with his birth date and gender, and that he was the only person admitted to Massachusetts General Hospital around that time with those factors. And that's how he was re-identified. And this was a huge influential result, because this became the basis of the way that HIPAA defines how privacy is supposed to be done. So that study, a lot of people ask this question, like, well, is that a one-off? Like, was he the only person that was like that? And it was like, nope, he was not. And you take a 5-digit zip, a birth date, and a gender in the US, and somewhere in the vicinity of more than 50% of the United States is going to be uniquely determined by those factors, right? There's many different ways of estimating this. I think what really matters is that it's not small. That type of an investigation, that proceeded through like the early 2000s, that kind of just set the whole world on fire. And you find all these studies that talk about how do you re-identify somebody from some particular feature. And I can show you all these studies on demographics in the US and Canada and in Australia and elsewhere. You're going to see studies that look at like diagnosis codes and rare diseases, health survey responses, what happens with lab tests. There's a whole bunch of research around DNA, and the list will go on and on and on. I stopped keeping track of this a couple of years ago. This is like the tip of the iceberg. You can just do like there was a study that came out a couple of days ago talking about how this happens with like mobile wearables as well. And why people care about this is not just due to the potential for embarrassment. There's real questions about like, does law enforcement get interested in using this information to track people and potentially investigate for things that people were not necessarily proud of? And so this is the concern. The concern is that there will be re-identifications of individuals when you share the detailed health information. Okay. All right. So that's where I'm going to take a step back and say that's what we're worried about. But you then have to think about, well, when does this happen? Okay. Like, is this something that we should be worried about all the time? And I'd say, well, with enough time, with enough effort, with enough incentive to do this, and if you give somebody enough money to do it, possibly as part of the incentive, you're going to see these types of attacks perpetrated. And so if that's the case, if we think that it's an incentive structure, then what we know is that these things have possibilities. They can happen, but it's not necessarily going to be a sure thing. It's not guaranteed to happen. And so this is where we were coming from when we started to build the All of Us research program. And for those of you that don't know what All of Us is, it's about a $2 billion enterprise that was started by our government to create one large cohort of people in the United States, about 1 million people, who would contribute their medical records, their biospecimens, surveys, and mobile Fitbit type of information into a resource that could be reused for research purposes. And so we started building this about 6 years ago. And it's now up and running. We have publicly available data that people can take a look at. And if you want to dig into it, you can look at the data browser that we've got online at this link. And it's got many different types of information, as I alluded to. You drill down into this, like this is what we've shown on the public front-facing side, right? So you can do counts around, what types of diagnoses have these individuals received? What is the most prevalent diagnosis, right? Here we're showing it's pain, right? And then after that, there's level of infection, and you've got problems with metabolic disorders, right? And it's on the orders of hundreds of thousands of people. We've also built a workbench, and so basically we've got Jupyter notebooks that people can spin up, and I'll walk through this in a second, to interact with the data. But this is a little different than the public front-facing side. What we did was we built a tiered level approach. So the public data, as I alluded to, it's summary statistics only. It's also univariate statistics. We don't allow for bivariate or any type of a joint analysis over a combination of demographics of people. That's what happens in these sandbox environments with the workbench. And what we've done is we've created two different tiers. One is what's called the registered tier. And anyone who is in a trusted organization that enters into an agreement with the NIH, they can get access to this. Now, currently, this is a group of people who we've got this available to academic organizations and not-for-profits in the United States. And then we've done analysis on the data to show that the risk of re-identification of these individuals, given this context, is expected to be low. I meant to have that up earlier. People ask, where is this? We built this all out on Google Cloud Platform. We're using the TerraBio system on top of that, and then we've got Jupyter Notebooks sitting on top of that. What Terra gives you the ability to do is create workspaces that you can then share with different groups and invite people to come into your own workspace. So that's set the stage for the registered tier. Then we more recently created the controlled tier. This came out late last year, where registered is expected to kind of be like the beta zone, where we're doing this with trusted organizations first, and then we're going to be expanding out towards a broader citizen scientist set of groups moving forward. And then what we'll be left with is the controlled environment. Those are still our trusted investigators, and it's in that zone where we've put the genomic data. We're now 250,000 whole genome sequences, and we've got more detail around some of the demographics around these people. Importantly, though, the way that this is still set up, both of these environments are considered to be non-human subjects designation under the common rule, and the NIH's IRB has approved it as such. How did we get there? So this is a super high level perspective on what is in these different tiers. Like, what were we concerned about? So things like dates of birth or dates of death or dates of events. In the registered tier, where we're going to be going on a much more broad public manner, we do something very similar to what HIPAA says, which is, have like 1 year of ambiguity around these events. So we do random shifts on a per patient basis. We generalize where exactly they live to the US state, and we make some specific edits towards some of the smaller vulnerable populations with respect to race, ethnicity, sexual orientation. And then you'll see like some of the things that were considered to be potential identifiers that we didn't put in that space were things like whether or not somebody was on active military duty, whether or not they were in a motor vehicle accident, and just we don't put any free text in there at the moment. You can see there's a lot more detail in the controlled tier, right? There's still some degree of generalization on certain things, but there's not complete generalization or shifts like what we do in the registered tier. So let me skip over this part. There's a question that always comes up about, there's a relationship to how do you relate to like what goes on in HIPAA, because there's this question about like, there's what can possibly be used as a quasi-identifier, and there's this question about like what's a catch-all, and we worked under the premise that said that we were interested in data that could readily relate back to an individual, their identity, and this is a bit of an educated guess in that regard, right? And so like things that are not explicitly listed in HIPAA and what's called the safe harbor list are things like trial numbers or barcodes, and these are the things that we know that the federal government was concerned with. But it didn't necessarily mean that it's any possible combination of unique values for representing someone. And this was one of our guiding principles as we built this. So we built this system, right? And now we're asking this question of like, well, what are we worried about? What keeps us up at night? So the reason why we didn't choose something like HIPAA is because if you use their safe harbor model, they have a situation which they say you can have unlimited features that can go out the door, right? And what we're worried about is this mosaic effect where you tell me something about somebody's race, their ethnicity, their sex, what insurance they have. And this list could go on and on about things that are not explicitly told, where you're told you have to remove these, but you need to get some handle on this. So we tried not to be in a situation where we wanted like completely open environment. And we didn't want to be in a situation where there was a lack of control, right? Such that if you de-identify this data, things like HIPAA and the common rule, they're no longer involved in the oversight, and there's a lack of accountability, right? So there's no federal oversight, there's just actually no oversight, right? And so like HIPAA doesn't really have a requirement for binding people contractually, which is why we went in this direction. So we kind of stood by this interpretation of the way the federal regulation is written that talks about risk and says that there's an expectation that if you're going to share data, that you need to show that the risk is very small. Now, what exactly is that? How do you define risk is what I'm going to come to in a moment. But what's notable about the way the regulation is written is that you need to show that you have an adversarial scenario in mind. You have an anticipated recipient. And then you have to make this decision about what is reasonably available information that recipient could use to commit the identification, right? I showed you an example much earlier with the governor, but that's a very special case. So there's this question that, so if you have some intuition into what might be exploitable, what your potential identifiers might be, you're going to have a question about what can you do to them? And there's lots of things that you can do. And I'll walk you through some of this in a moment, but let's think of this in a high level, right? You could do things like make things more abstract. Take a 5-digit zip code, move it up to 4-digit, 3-digit, take it all the way up to state. You could remove a feature entirely, as we did, right? We did some suppressions. You could do randomization, like I showed you with the date. You could do it on a uniformly distributed approach, or you could do like what differential privacy techniques do, which is select some value according to some Laplacian noise distribution, right? And then you could do like backward shifts or forward shifts on dates, but it depends on expectations on if you were to do this, for example, with a COVID related population and you tried to do backward shifts and you shifted people back before when COVID even existed, and then you have a diagnosis that says COVID, that's going to be a problem because it's going to bound what these dates could be. So you'd be careful about how you apply these types of approaches. All right. You could also do like the encryption approaches that I talked about at the very beginning of this. Okay. So that's where you could, let's just say you have different ways to control the system, different ways of tuning the data. When we're talking about risk, right, a lot of people fixate on this notion of the chance of a re-identification is basically going to be how unique are you in the data set? How replicable is the information that represents you in other resources, right? Is your date of birth consistent across different resources? And can I get access to those resources, or are they completely top secret such that I shouldn't worry about that? And oftentimes when people are doing risk analysis with privacy, they focus on this and they say, as long as you address these issues, you're good. But in reality, that's a very myopic view of privacy, because it says that's really more of a focus on what's the chance that somebody's going to be re-identified, given that the attack was even committed in the first place. And it neglects this prior probability of what's the chance that somebody runs an attack. And that's where deterrence theory comes into play. That's why we adopted things like use agreements, and you use unique logins and audits, strategies that some people might use to try to mitigate risk, because they might say, look, it's not going to be free. You can't just walk in the door and do everything that you want to do with this. You're going to have to pay to do some analysis. And there's an expectation that if that you're not really meant to be here, that pay for access is going to help people not misuse the system, right? You could also do downsampling. It says I don't give you data on the entire population, and so therefore you might not be able to determine if somebody's truly unique in that population, or if they're just unique in the sample that I've given you. But there's all different types of additional deterrents that you can use. So when you run these types of risk analyses, right, this is like this whole modeling component that I've talked about earlier. You're asking these questions about, so under what conditions is the data of concern? And how did we make a decision at all of us that we were going to share all of the drug-related events with a patient? We said, well, a drug dose may be unique. The combination of your drug doses may be unique over time, but these are not accessible to the public in any known resource that we're aware of, right? Similarly, adversaries who are receiving the data, they don't have every piece of knowledge about somebody. So we have to model this notion of incompleteness. So what we do is we really did go through the entire resource, and we categorized all the variables by their gross risk. And we started with the high risk variables, like obviously the things that have to go away, like social security number and their name. And then we were interested in the moderate risk. And this is where we spent a lot of our time. These are things that we know they have the potential to identify someone based on historical evidence. And so we know that like things like an individual's age and gender and when their date of service occurred and where they received service could have an implication for who they are, and we can exploit it. And then we were left with all of the low risk ones. These were the things that failed on those three principles of uniqueness and replicability and availability. And so like, you know, like that's how we got an extremely large amount of clinical information through the door. Right. And so all the while we were looking at, well, we've got multiple tiers, we've got different expectations of who's going to be in those tiers and what their anticipated capabilities are. Okay. So this is really where I say it's you have to have some type of an understanding of who the potential users are. You can totally have a situation in which you're going to have public use data sets and you've got no control over who's going to be the user. That's fine. That just means your prior probability of attack is going to be a 1, no problem. But let's look at what happens when we can have a little bit more control in the system. All right. So I alluded to this a little bit ago, where I said there were techniques that you could apply to try and control the data. And over time, there's been an evolution of these techniques, right? Like we've seen like K-based approaches like K-anonymity. We then saw L-diversity and T-closeness introduced. And then Cynthia Dwork introduced the notion of epsilon differential privacy. And then Dan Kiefer and others introduced the notion of pufferfish. And the list will just keep going on over time. What I'm going to tell you right now is I actually don't care about any of this at the moment, because I think all of these are just data-based controls. And when we start talking about risk analysis, we start thinking about this as if we've got an organization that wants to share data, like we have in all of us, and then you have potential users of the data, many of which are good, many of which have no ill intent, some of which may have some ill intent. We think of this as a two-body problem. And we think about this in terms of, okay, so if I manipulate the data, that's one type of a disincentive. But I could do many other things, as I alluded to before. Now, once you represent what all the things are that you can do to the data or do to the environment, that allows you to think of this more strategically, right? And then if you can model strategies, then you can model the entire process of access and data distribution. So this is what we talk about in this paper that came out a couple of years ago, where we modeled the different ways in which the system can be exploited as one Bayesian network. And then based on that, we can compute some type of a re-identification risk score for each record in the data set. I'm not going to go through the details of this right now. I will say you can take a look at the paper. There's accompanying source code, you could restructure this network if you see fit. What I will say is, there's 3 parts to it. There's this question of like, can you re-identify someone as being unique or distinguishable in a data set, itself? Then the question is, what's the chance that they might be unique in the population? And then what's the chance that somebody might be successful if they just made a random guess? In other words, these are 3 different types of adversarial settings that are all being combined to create a single risk score. But what we do for the most part is we think of this as this 2-party game, where or we think of these as security games, or what sometimes people refer to as leader follower or stack overflow games. And we think of the data publisher as one of those parties, right? In our situation, it's all of us. And when we have a data sharing strategy, we think we know what level of detail we want to disclose in the data given the recipients. And we have an idea of like what level of benefit we can get off of this, because we know how much manipulation we've done to the data, and we have some estimation of like how that influences potential analytics. That's our utility. What we don't know initially is we don't know what type of risk is going to be induced by the potential users. And so we say, okay, well, let's play a bunch of different strategies, right? Let's like hold back certain variables. Let's generalize demographics to different degrees of detail. And then let's play this all out. So this is, let's say, like a single strategy first. And then we look at the recipient and we say, okay, there's many different things that they could do in the system. And they're going to get their own benefit from running an attack. And in doing so, they're going to also induce a certain level of risk. And you can play this out over all the different ways in which they could attack the system. And they could chain these together. But as they chain them together, they become more and more costly. They become more and more complex. And they do become their own strategies. So you can enumerate all these potential strategies. And then you can say, so what's the one that maximizes the overall utility or the overall benefit to that recipient? And it's that one that you say, okay, that's the risk that is going to be associated with my first strategy. All right. So you can then do this as the defender or the publisher for every strategy that you've considered. And each time you do it, you may find that the attacker may have a different local optima or different optima for their solution, right? But all the while, you're going to keep filling in your utility risk profile, right? And you can do this for all of your potential strategies for sharing. And then at the end of the day, you can choose your strategy that maximizes the overall risk utility benefit. So I'm going to give you an example of how this can work based on some of our older stuff. I'm going to show you like a couple different game variations and how to think about this. So one is what I refer to as the safe harbor game. This is what a lot of people are familiar with HIPAA, where it says, hey, there's 18 things you need to remove. And if you remove those 18 things, you're good to go. You don't even need to measure risk. That's what a lot of institutional review boards are familiar with. We'll look at how that plays out. And then I'm going to play this basic Stackelberg game. And then I'm going to do another version where I'm going to show you what happens with the limit of what you can do is consistent with safe harbor. And the reason why I'm doing this is that some institutional review boards we've found are just not comfortable with creating new ways of sharing data, even though HIPAA says, look, you can do a risk-based approach. A lot of them say, look, we're familiar with safe harbor. We're going to go with that. What we're going to see is like, well, do you really need to play it out into the limit of what safe harbor allows you to do? Is that your best decision? And then along the way that we were doing this research, one of the things that we found, which was, it shouldn't have been surprising, but we weren't expecting it, was we ended up in situations in which there was risk, but the incentive structure was set up such that if you have a rational attacker, they choose not to attack, because their return on investment is going to be negative. Now, this basically, what I'm going to show you is a foundational search problem, because you're going to have many different ways in which you can manipulate the system. And so you've got like all these policies that you're going to be scoring them on risk and utility, or privacy and utility. And so you can turn this into like your favorite search strategy, and you can use genetic programming or ILP, or come up with some type of an inductive search. You can pick your favorite strategy. What's going to be more important for the purposes of what I'm showing you is just the fact that you can get to interesting solutions here. Okay. We've also taken this out into like a much more, we've replicated a lot of re-identification attacks over time. And there was a paper that we came out with last year that looked at what happens with multi-stage attacks and how people have done DNA re-identification studies. And we did a revisiting to see if they're really as bad as people said they were. And basically the moral of the story is that, you know, there's a lot of experiments. This is your typical alphabet soup of all your possible experiments. But basically what you end up with is that you find out like the attacks have been presented usually as worst case scenarios, and they may not be as bad as they have been suggested. So the case study that I wanted to walk you through was a situation in which it simulated 3,000 census records. And we computed the average payoff per record. Now, how did we do that? We assumed that the benefit per record was going to be $1,200. Where does that come from? Basically, we were looking at how much money was being paid by the federal government through NIH grants to recipients for the generation of genomic records. And so what we found was that if you looked at the total amount of grant dollars and the total number of records that were being generated from these studies, it amortized to about $1,200 per record that was being generated. So you could argue that the grant recipient was being paid $1,200 for every piece of data that they were sharing at maximum. We then said that the cost of a violation was going to be $300. That's the amount of money that an organization ends up paying for a breach of the HIPAA security rule. And we looked at public records access, and we found that it would be about $4 to access an identified record on somebody of interest. We then, you know, since this is a game, we built a very simple payoff matrix, and we said that the publisher was going to receive a level of payout that was proportional to the amount of detail that they put in their data. We said that if there was no attack, they'd get all that money. And that if there was no attack, the attacker would get nothing, right? If there was an attack that got committed, we would imagine that there's a certain probability of success, and we'll walk through how that works, and that there would be a certain amount of loss that was induced to the publisher as an artifact. So the amount that they would have received, VG, right, minus the expected loss that the attacker has induced. And we're looking at this in terms of like zero-sum transfer. So whatever the publisher pays, that's what the attacker is going to receive. And so then there's a certain cost to run this attack, and that was that $4 I alluded to. We played a very simple generalization strategy. We didn't do any type of differential privacy for perturbation. We just said we're going to keep walking the data up into higher and higher levels of granularity in terms of how we're going to protect the system. And so this is just an example of like what we did with the age distribution. Oh, and I tend to get a lot of questions around, you know, where did that $4 come from? If you've ever tried to learn information about somebody, you might just do a Google search. Google, you know, gets you a little bit of the way there, but really a lot of people should go to information brokers like Intellius that just compose these huge dossiers on people, and then they just charge for access to the resource, and it's a relatively nominal charge. Okay, so here's an example. Here's the outcome. We've got my publisher, 30,000 census records, and the census records in this situation, it was a combination of age, gender, zip code of residence, and the race of the individual. And I've got the attacker. Okay. Now what's notable here is that the safe harbor model that a lot of people tend to rely upon under HIPAA, it has a certain balance, right? So you're getting some payout that's under $1,000, more than $500 per record. The attacker will be successful at times if you send safe harbor data out to the world, and it's, you know, around 40 cents in this payoff. All right, so it's not zero, right? If you play the Stackelberg model, Stackelberg says, look, if you really are willing to tolerate some risk, you can get a higher payout at the end of the day. But you're going to have to accept the fact that the attacker is going to get a higher payout as well. If you're not comfortable with that, if the institutional review board says, you know, I don't want to do anything wacky, we don't want to allow all ages to be at 5-year age windows, right? And we set that so that you could have like 5-year age windows of like, so like 95 to 100, 101 to 105. You know, maybe if you're not comfortable with that, and the IRB says, look, nobody over the age of 90, we can say, look, you can do that, but you probably shouldn't share everything that you have the ability to share, because there's just no additional benefit towards getting the data out the door. And if you remove a little bit of the data, you can actually make it way less enticing to the adversary. And then what was notable to us was that, you know, it says, look, if you don't use safe harbor, and you don't want to be in a situation where the attacker has any benefit that they receive, you can remove a little bit of that data that you would have shared under the basic Stackelberg framework, and you can get to an expected no attack situation. And you can still do a lot better than under safe harbor. So this is the type of mindset that we used as we were building all of us. And the details of what we've done is in this paper. And we basically said, we know that we have to make some assumptions about an adversary. And so instead of just trying to push the data to the maximum limit of what we could share under these frameworks, we said, there is a chance that our estimate of adversarial capability could be off. And so we basically increased our expected capabilities of the adversary. We made them much more powerful than what we expect to happen in the real world. And that's where we decided to set our protection model, because the way we figure this is we're going to be able to put data out into the world, but we're only going to be able to do it once. And if we get it wrong from the outset, then we can't pull it back. And so we're more comfortable starting more conservatively and then revealing more data over time. Okay, so this is the notion of how we're using the concept of de-identification in our system. I wanted to close on a couple of observations. First, this notion of de-identification or sharing data in clear this way, it inherently is designed to manipulate data, right? And so this is going to be a bit of a concern for anybody who's analyzing data. More importantly, you run into this phenomenon that the smaller the group of interest, the greater the chance that you're going to have to hide some information about them in some way, right? And that can have major implications on bias and generalizability of anything that you learn off of the data in the system. So you can think about this in terms of like you're hiding information on these small populations. Examples of this would be you don't have many transgender individuals, so you hide the data. You don't have many Pacific Islanders, so you hide their data. You don't have many people in rural settings, so you hide their data. The artifact of this is that you basically are saying you don't have sufficient size, you don't have standing in this data set, you're out. And the other artifact is that what it means is that the rich get richer. The people who are in the majority populations, they get studied more. The way we think of this in terms of like this utility privacy trade-off, in that you want more privacy, you're going to have to trade off some utility, but this is how things would look for a majority population. We think about this is the trade-off. It's a much steeper trade-off for a minority population, and then it's an even steeper trade-off for a super minority population. You think of a minority population in the United States as like a Black population, or a super minority as like a Native American population. I kind of wish this was the case, but it's really more along these lines, and that there's not sufficient data on these smaller populations. And as a result, their initial opportunity for utility is actually starting at a lower point in time. And so when you choose a fixed privacy requirement, like you do under like a federal regulation, what ends up happening is that your operating points are such that, yeah, you give everybody the same level of privacy, but then you end up with different levels of overall utility. And that's the biggest concern here. So could this seems to have a relationship to the notion of fairness, right? You are amending minority data more than you're amending majority data. So you learn more about the majority, you make better policies for the majority. As I said, the rich get richer. So could you do something to balance the system? And so this is the last part of what I want to talk about, which is, could you use things like synthetic data? A lot of people are talking about synthetic data now. There's an expectation that it might be able to help with algorithmic bias, but how do you do this, right? So this is an example of like why it's potentially useful, and then I'll walk you through what we've been doing in this space. Just as an example, what you see on the left, this is a great paper that came out in 2018 that showed that if you're trying to do image analysis to detect liver lesions, there's a certain amount of learning that you're going to get off of the real data. And then if you can simulate data that you haven't necessarily seen before, but is of a similar distribution, then you can, as you're training, increasing the amount of training, you hit a wall with the real data. But then the additional data, the new synthetic data, can augment the system and improve the amount of analysis, that the fidelity of the analysis. Similar findings have been found in other spaces with other types of data sets. This is on the right, it's a more general finding with analysis of deep nets with some general machine learning data sets. This notion of synthetic data, it's not crazy. Right? It's not new. Right? It's something that's actually been done for a number of years in the image processing community. It's evolved heavily over the last decade, and it's actually not even new in the health data space. There's actually been a lot of research that Jerry Ryder has done on how to create synthetic data for administrative data sets, and then like he's done work with health survey data, and you can do this with the original data. You can also say let's say we do synthetic data. Is there residual risk associated with it? Can we measure that? And then subsequently, what happens if we only want to generate partially synthetic data to facilitate a system? So how do you do this? The way that people have been thinking about this is that you could either perturb the original data, and then you're left with some people would argue that differentially private data could be argued as not being the original records of some perturbed view. Or what you could do is you can actually simulate new data, where you learn a model off the data and then you simulate things that look like the real data, but you might simulate things that don't look like the real data. And so where we've done, where a lot of groups have gone in the last couple of years is with this notion of generative adversarial networks or GANs. And basically what it means is you take your real data and then you learn a deep net off of it. You use that deep net to generate new records, and these are your fake records. And then what you do is you introduce a second deep net, and you use this for classification purposes to try and discriminate between a fake record and a real record. And if you can discriminate correctly, then you basically are going to do the inverse of classification. You're going to say, hey, you actually are really good at telling the difference between this. Something's wrong in my deep net. You need to go back propagate, and you need to retune the system because you're not generating data as good as you should. And then the same thing can happen with real data. Go back, and if you can still discriminate, back prop, fix it. And then you keep playing this as a game, right? And you keep doing this until it's an equal chance of failure of discrimination, right? You send it real data, it thinks it's fake data. You send it fake data, it thinks it's real data. So in those situations, there's no need to change the system, right? And that's when you sufficiently train your data. I mean, this is basically the way that ChatGPT and similar types of generative AI is working today. Okay, so we introduced how to do this with health data, structured EHR data, which is a lot more tricky than visual information like you get with faces. About 6 years ago, this was work I did with Jimeng Soon's group, and basically we showed that with this type of a GAN simulator, we could do a lot better than variational autoencoders, and then we evolved this over the last couple of years, and we showed that. The way in which these systems were originally evaluated was that they looked at first order distributions of do you have the right distribution of diagnosis codes in your system? And we took this out into latent dimensions so that you're doing things like principal components analysis and independent component analysis to understand the topology of the space. One of the challenges with these types of simulators, though, these types of learning frameworks, is that they don't usually have constraints. So you can have women who have prostate cancer, or you could ask ChatGPT a question and it can hallucinate or lie. And so we have a paper that came out a couple of years ago that showed how to probabilistically embed these constraints into these types of networks. And then more recently, we moved on to how to show to do time series analysis, so that we basically hook together static simulators with LSTMs and recurrent neural networks. These are not perfect. Things can go wrong, and these are known as inversion attacks. Just an example with images, what can happen is you can say, well, this is my simulated image, but you might say, well, that looks really similar to the real data that you had. And these are what are known as zero-shot inversion attacks. Where this happens or could happen for health data is that why that's happened itself is you've got mimicry, where you've got insufficient training data, and that leads to mode collapse in your training environment, and you end up just basically replicating the original data. And then you have different types of inference attacks, where one is what's called a membership inference attack, where if you know some information about somebody of interest, you can then probe the system to determine if they were in the underlying training data set. You could then say, what's the chance that I could predict something new about this individual given what I knew about them to run the attack? And it's this combination of membership and attribute inference where you get worried, where you say, okay, well, now I can prove somebody's in your underlying data set and I've learned something new. So we've built an entire benchmarking toolkit for looking at all the different privacy concerns, and we have a couple different utility measures, like based on things like KL divergence and other distributional measures, that gives you some intuition into how well these simulators are working and what trade-offs they're offering between those two spaces. Let me skip this since I know I'm just about out of time. Final note. So what I've basically been showing you is that, if you're going to share data, de-identification can be helpful. Synthetic data generation can help. It's not necessarily a panacea. There's always going to be a risk of re-identification. But there's this notion that risk exists in any security setting. It's just a matter of how much risk are you willing to tolerate. And in that respect, I will admit I'm not a big believer in public use data sets. I think that there needs to be some level of accountability. Otherwise you end up in a situation in which you just assume that everybody's going to exploit the data all the time. So there should be some degree of deterrence. I think data use agreements are a good thing. I think if you're going to do this with respect to a company, there's got to be some level of company training. Again, this notion of risk, it's just proportional to the amount of trustworthiness that you have in the system. So public systems, very different than non-public systems. I think I went a little over time, but I'll stop there. It's always a little tricky when you can't see anybody's face.
Yeah, thank you, Brad. This is a wonderful presentation. Yeah, I think this really serves a great overview for many of us who are interested in working on data privacy and from statistical point of view. So for the audience, feel free to post your question in the Q&A session. So meanwhile, I can maybe start with some questions for you. This is a webinar hosted by ASA, so I assume most of the audience are from statistical community. I think the big question maybe for you, Brad, is that, from your perspective, what do you feel, what contribution can people from statistics or biostatistics can make, on this domain?
So I think that representing the distribution. So if you were to look at the Stackelberg games that we play, we make assumptions on the distributions of the information that an adversary has access to. And so having better intuition into the types of distributions that could be exploited and what the variation is associated with those distributions would be really helpful. We tend to do things a lot more empirically, and we focus on simulation more than trying to get towards theoretical bounds of the capability of an adversary. So we build up 95% confidence intervals around an adversary's capability by just running Monte Carlo, and we're simulating it over and over. That would be a really great opportunity for statisticians to get involved. I think if you look at the synthetic data problem, I think there's really poor understanding of the privacy boundary conditions that happen in these systems. A lot of what we do in that space is, again, we're making assumptions of what adversaries can try and learn off the data and relate it back to the original data. And again, this is, it tends to be very heavily driven by simulation as opposed to trying to get to theoretical bounds. I think to the extent that the statistical community can formalize a lot of what the computational community has done, it would help give much more justifiable claims of data protection to organizations that are thinking about using these techniques, as well as the regulatory authorities that are trying to figure out, is this sufficient for meeting the requirements of certain regulations?
Wonderful. So we also have some question in the Q&A. So let me read it to the audience. The first question is, as a PhD student interested in regression analysis in high-dimensional area, I came across your abstracts. I'm curious to know what are the common methods of machine learning algorithm used for prediction or selection in large biomedical data sets.
That's a very broad question. So I think depends on the type of data that you're dealing with. One of the things that we're seeing is that a lot of the medical data is becoming highly categorical and not very, it doesn't fit very well to your traditional regression models, whether it be logistic or even hierarchical strategies of regression. A lot more work is being put in place with boosting and bagging techniques. So things like XGBoost has kind of become one of the more flexible strategies for doing classification. Similar things like random forest based models. So trying to, do ensemble learning as opposed to trying to fit a single model. I think that's one of the reasons why like a lot of people keep running towards things like even like deep networks. They're running towards like big deep networks, and that's actually, it's interesting, but that might actually be problematic because it still assumes that you can represent a single model for the whole system and it will just fit into one big nonlinear representation. I don't think that that's really true when you're dealing with highly categorical and discrete systems. So that's something that you have to be aware of. I also think that the other thing that a lot of people need to be dealing with is how do you handle missing information? And do you do imputation? Do you do multiple imputation? What are the challenges associated with what are the limits of imputation? A lot of these data sets are missing on the order of 20% to 30%, if not more, of a variable. That causes you to run into big challenges.
Yes. And wonderful. We have one more question. So the next question is, for clinical studies intended for drug approval, efficacy in some subsets are important. As clinical study involve more EHR, how do you propose mitigating risk of de-identifications?
Oh, I don't even know if I can answer that. I think this is where you have to have two tiers or multiple tiered access, because I think there's going to be a level of detail that's going to have to be given to the regulators to do their review and approval versus what you're obligated to give to the public. I would say take a look at what we did at the European Medicines Agency. So under policy 70 at EMA, there's a anonymization requirement for pharma companies to make their trials data public. So anything that passed through Europe, it has to be made public. And there's a whole bunch of guidance that they have on where they felt the level of risk, what adversarial capability looked like for clinical study reports and the information derived from clinical study reports. So I think that's, I have concerns with making clinical trials data public. Let me explain real quick, since we're just about out of time, and I got it as well. When EMA made the policy that they were going to be making clinical study reports public, they kept tabs on who were the people who were accessing the data, because they said, we're going to make it public, but you have to go through a a portal where you would have to say, hey, I'm so-and-so, here's my email. All right. What they found out was that the second largest group of users for the clinical study reports were lawyers and were not statisticians. So it was trialists first, and then it was lawyers. And it was very surprising. Basically what you had was that there were a lot of people who were trying to figure out if the pharma companies were hiding anything in their trials and whether or not they could be subject to any type of legal action. That is what freaks out a lot of pharma companies when they are being told that they have to share data.
Wow.
All right.
Yeah. Great. Yeah,
Thanks.
I think we're out of time. So yeah, thank you, Brad, again for your